Hello and welcome to Cabbie Conversations. I'm joined as usual by James and a special guest here, new timer on the channel. It's Odysseus. Say hello,
Hello.
Odysseus.
Hello.
Brilliant. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about sports today. And if I were to ask you two, I'll start with you, Oddie, since you're the newcomer. If you had to wipe a sport off the face of the earth for it never to be participated in again, what would it be?
Well, this is a bit of a paradox for me because I'm sort of like one of those football idiots that every sport they don't like, they just say isn't a sport. So if I was to answer this by like saying what, one of the sports I don't like, such as cricket or rugby, I would be acknowledging that it is a sport and therefore defying like my whole logic and ethos.
It's a paradox, I get you.
If I was to get rid of one though, I'd probably go with American football. For so many reasons. Like it's just like for a start, it just summarizes everything that's like obnoxious, commercialized, and generally annoying about different aspects of US culture. It also makes them think that even though actual football is by far the most popular sport in the world, that gets downgraded to being called soccer, which is really annoying. So yeah, you need like, and it's just a bad version of an even worse of like a rubbish sport anyway, which is rugby. So yeah, just
I wouldn't talk bad about rugby, thank you very much. But I do agree that American football is a very frustrating sport. They have like 3 teams within a team. Like, they have the attack team and what's it, the offense team, and then the kicking team. It's like, can you just not actually pick a concise team who can actually do things instead of like one? It's very limiting in the sport. It doesn't allow for like encompass a collection of sporting abilities, which is an issue I have with American football. And then also the rate of concussion, like rugby, I'm going to defend rugby here. Rugby has like sensible means of protecting against concussion and stuff, which in long term can cause memory loss and a lot of serious injuries further down the line, early onset dementia. As American football, they think, oh, more padding is better because it's more aggressive. It's like, no, you're actually just hurting your players more. So I would agree with you that American football is a foolish sport. But
do you think that, like you said about it symbolizes everything wrong with American culture? Do you think that that's like, to me, that's almost more like a symptom of the problem, like in high school, how everyone goes towards or gravitates towards either you're a jock or you're this or you're that. I don't know. To me, that's almost more of a symptom of the problem rather than like if you got rid of American football, they would just have some other means of establishing that social hierarchy in some other way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, it is a symptom rather than like the cause. But that doesn't mean that it's not annoying, like how specifically on that day of the year on Twitter. The other thing that's also like another thing that is symptomatic with American football of the general things that I dislike about the US is the fact that it's become like so it's like you have British and like I guess other non-American people like trying to get into it. Like it annoys me so much when people who clearly like know nothing about it and aren't genuinely interested, but they think it's fashionable to be like, oh, Super Bowl XIX or whatever it is. Like, ugh, it's just.
I think I know who you're referring to there, but I won't name names.
But the Americanization of sports is a good point because American have like the World Series. It's like for like baseball or something, but it's like it's only you.
It's basically only you, yeah.
That play baseball, and you're going to call it the World Series. So American sport in general has issues, but what I would say what I would consider not a sport is Quidditch. Quidditch is not a sport. It's just people running around with like a short stick between their legs, like someone spins around pretending to be the snitch. It's a complete joke.
So can you explain to the layman's in the audience, and when I say that I mean me, what is, like, I've obviously seen Harry Potter, but how does it translate into real life? Like, what are the real actual rules of normal Quidditch?
So I believe there is a player who is the snitch. Like there's just a random, and you have to go around and chase this person, and that's one people's job. And then the rest of it is done with actual like balls and like got holes with hoops in them that you have to like throw and bat the balls into. But I understand like the premise of Quidditch is very exciting in the magical world, and I can see that it would, but we can't fly, so it just looks like a load of weirdos running around in a
It's like
park,
LARPing or something.
and it's just really, it looks really silly. Also, I think on the way, I would think I was walking when I was at university. I was walking into the library one day and watching the university Quidditch team do fitness, and they just could not do press ups, and I was so unimpressed. Their backs were like, instead of being straight, were like convex, so caving in. Their hips are on the floor. I was like, that's not how you do a press up. That's just not.
Sure, it's
fair,
like people
so
who watch
many
Harry
people do that,
Potter.
though.
You know, those are the kind of people that do Quidditch.
I was going to say,
yeah.
sorry.
Go on, Noddy.
No.
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, I think so many people do that with the press ups. Like, so many people just like get the technique. Like, not that I'm a gym lad by any stretch.
Yeah, you
But-
are. Don't
Like,
sell yourself short.
Even I can see like a shocking level. But also, just whilst we're talking about things that are and aren't a proper sport, I'm sure we'll all agree that chess absolutely is a proper sport. And it's not only that it's a proper sport, but it is the best sport in the world.
Chess is not the best sport, but it is a
It's a
sport. and
game. It's not a sport.
You could do something called chess boxing. So where you like you play like a move in chess, and then you have a round of boxing. That's the thing.
It's
So,
like
like-
exercising every part of you. It's like your brain and your
Yeah.
body.
But
Yeah.
the thing is, though, most chess games last a lot longer than, because I mean, what, 10 rounds is boxing or about that?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
the
it's
most chess games
12.
are a lot longer. 12. Most chess games are a lot longer, so that's tricky.
Do the moves get less intelligent as the more you batter your opponent's brain in? Like,
I think that's the point. I think it's a test because fighting is also just purely exhausting. So
Yeah.
it's a kind of like a mix between like physical and mental stamina. Because also, I mean, a good sport is a test of physical ability and mental capacity. Because good sports are, I think, are strategical. So you have to work around, you have to exercise both, which is why to me a good athlete is not the traditional form of an athlete, which is like all brawn and no brains. A good athlete has a brain too.
yeah. I've never gotten into football personally, but hearing people talk about it, it does sound like a lot of it is to do with positioning and, actual skill, and sort of there's some tactical element to it, sort of thing. Whereas it's not just a show of pure strength type thing.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not a footballer. I played hockey and to quite a high level, and I swam, and both had tactical elements to them. So for a race, you would think, oh, you just go as fast as you can all the time. It was like, you can't do that, because you, especially for a longer race, you can't do that. So it's choosing when to push. So you often want to start out, get a good start, then you might ease back, and then 3/4 of the way through the race, you might really start to push the other player, the rest of the people in the race. So there are tactics. If you're doing a relay, I found at school, because I was the quickest at school. If I went last, the rest of my team slacked, and then we'd lose the race because I had to make up for all the distance. If I went first and made a big lead, they would then be afraid of losing the lead, and then they'd all swim much faster. So there is an element of tactics. And with hockey or football, there's things called a press, which is a defensive way of creating pressure on the other team to make an error. There's then positions. So like there'll be like, you can have like a setup of defenders, like a 4-3-3. So 4 defenders, 3 mids, 3 forwards, the goalkeeper, or you can have it a different way. You can have a 3-4-3, which is 4 mids, 3 defenders, 3 strikers. It depends where you want to overload the pitch to make it either difficult for them to score, or difficult for them to score with a defensive press, or difficult for them to like to break through your line. It depends that's how
Exactly. It's almost like warfare. It's almost like an evolution of that concept.
Yeah.
It's like creating a defensive line. But speaking of sport, the main topic today is sport as a sort of international business and the corruption that comes from that. Because we often think of sport as, well, like we discussed the sort of what makes a sport, but I think the ultimate idea in most people's minds is that sport is sort of just a game. It's something that you do, and then obviously you could make careers out of that, and that's one thing. But I think maybe people wouldn't realize how much sport is nowadays a business. It's a huge money making machine at international level. And well, I'll let Oddie kick this off because you gave the idea for the discussion. So Oddie, why don't you say about how in football specifically, how there can be corruption there and who owns what clubs and that stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the one thing I want to go a little step further than what you mentioned there, and that like not only are they businesses, but I think the key difference that like my area specifically I want to discuss was that they're actually like political sort of objects essentially. They're political means. So like the key thing, like when you came to me, like the key idea that I initially want to talk about was basically, like you mentioned, football ownership and sports washing. Just for those that may not be into it, like sports washing is basically when you use sport to wash your image politically. It's a form of subtle power. Again, I'll quickly touch on subtle power, which is basically in foreign policy, you originally have hard power, which is like military means, and soft power, which is say economic means, like you invest in a country's education to make yourself look good. Subtle power is even more subtle than that, which is where you like invest in something to basically improve the image, but it's not like forced economic power. It's like image gaining power through like
hearts and minds.
Through a certain vehicle. So that's basically like what we're talking about. And so to give a few examples, I mean, I think the easiest one to talk about is how basically there's been, I mean, it has cooled down a little, but there's been a sort of Cold War happening in the Arabian Gulf for a while, especially with sort of countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And this has been demonstrated in football massively. Qatar not only essentially owns PSG, the Qatar Sports Investment owns a club which is owned by Qatar Investments, which is owned by the Qatari government. So it's like very, very easy to like direct that back. But also you have the fact that Qatar is, as part of its national vision, the 2030 Qatar National Vision, they had to host a major tournament, which they of course have, with the World Cup, which has obviously been, a completely political vehicle because it's largely being used to improve the image and make Qatar a global country that everyone's interested in. But at the same time, it's hugely problematic because we've seen the deaths of the workers and how people are basically working in forced labor conditions, as the Human Rights Watch said, to build the stadiums and more generally in Qatar. So essentially, like what we're looking at with this stage is countries trying to use the sports through both clubs and international events to gain power for their own country. And I think that in the case of the Gulf states, if you're looking to see like what their final end is, it's like largely to, I guess, improve business and also tourism, because they're moving away from the oil economy because the oil's running out to perhaps a more tourist economy in the future. And it's like subtle power really helps them to do this. But given they have really poor human rights records, it's something that's quite questionable.
Yeah, well, why do you think? Oh, go on, James.
I was going to say I agree, because in the United Arab Emirates, isn't about 90% of its population actually not indigenous to the UAE. And a lot of them are employed, are migrants from places such as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and they come along and they're required to work in these brutal conditions for very low pay and squalid standards, while wealthy members of the Arab royal families maintain their wealth and basically capitalize off it for their own business gain. Another point of like, I'd say the idea of subtle power and presenting a front of I guess athletic strength would be the camps in China, the sports camps. This is where young children from very rural areas are basically recruited by the Chinese government and sent to sports camps from the ages of 4 or 6, and they're basically trained to become elite athletes in like swimming, gymnastics, whatever the government sees fit, so that they then go to the Olympics and win medals and display a prowess of China's strength. But the result of this is that obviously only a few people can make the Olympic squad. Even if you have a big Olympic squad, there tends not to be more than 400 people at the Olympics at any time. You could also have they also train for grueling hours, like 10 plus hours a day. You could easily suffer an injury, and then you're uneducated, you're poor, and there's been instances where most of them are made homeless afterwards, and they have no forms of making a living under the pretense of a limited amount of time of glory at the Olympics. It's very tragic, really.
Yeah, well, why, to step back a sec, why do you think it is that, countries like China and these Arab Emirates, like these sort of, I suppose it goes beyond businessmen, and they're pretty much like royal family members, like you say. Why do you think it is that these people put so much emphasis on sport as like a means of subtle power, like you say? Is it just because that sports are so universally sort of accepted, and they're so universally like, part of our daily lives, part of our daily enjoyment, that we almost don't think about it?
You see, I think that there's a couple of reasons. I think that so what I would say is that culturally, globally, the two biggest things are music and sport. Which one's bigger? Someone else can have that debate. But sport is like fundamentally a lot easier to manipulate, I would say, because you can buy a club, you can take over a club, you can host a tournament, as obviously does happen a lot. I think with music it's a bit trickier. If you're like someone, say Ed Sheeran, just for example, I think the likelihood of an agent buying you out for political means or how that would even, I just don't see that really working logistically.
Logistically, yeah, it wouldn't really work.
I don't really see it. And I think that also sports are a lot more tribal, especially going off what I've talked about with football. Like football is so tribal in the sense that people will argue things that aren't necessary. When you have, say for example, a massive club like a Man United, if you have hundreds of millions of people, and in many other big clubs tens of millions of people, who basically will support you, like not that many tend to go away because of like just the fact that there's such a monopoly by the European clubs, especially in the major European clubs, like that there only is one elite in football. So if you can manipulate a club like Man City or Paris Saint-Germain, you just naturally have a pretty big audience to project your like country's identity to. And it has largely been successful, not just through sports, but in general. If you look at how the Gulf states have tried to project themselves as liberal and modern, it's become a little bit more exposed. But generally, like think of how many people go on holiday to Dubai, and that kind of thing. And I think that it has been successful, very successful in using subtle power to become like a global player, when especially when you think of how small their indigenous populations are.
I would disagree with your point about music not having as much soft power or subtle power, but that's purely because I feel music can be very political, and there have been various movements that have moved through that, but that's for another discussion. I could talk about grime, like anti-Boris anti-conservative culture through grime, or the anti-Vietnam protesting and rock through the late 60s and early 70s, such as the Doors. But I will stop there.
I'll quickly respond to that and say I completely agree about the possible political. I think I maybe phrased my thing wrong. I think that there's plenty of political opportunity within music. As you rightly mentioned, the movements that have already happened and will probably continue to happen. But I think that in terms of the aspect from the style of sports washing, or a major country or individual trying to change their image through paying out on a musician, I think that possibility there is more limited. But I completely agree in the political ability of music.
I would argue,
I
yeah,
think
it's just one last point about the music. It's like I would argue the music is more individualist in the sense that it's at the end of the day, it's the artists who, at least most of the time, it's the artists who promote this message. It's not necessarily, a businessman from another country trying to sort of, promote tourism or anything like that in the same way that it is for sport. But yeah, anyway, carry on.
I agree. I think there are a lot of stakes to be made within which wealthy tycoons buying clubs, especially through the betting industry. And it's a massive way of making money. It's a great way of making money, and it could you could fixing games and stuff like that would definitely benefit you in a financial way. But I don't necessarily think that soft power is necessarily limited to countries in a sense. In the world of boxing, gangs have played a massive part in boxing picture, notably a man called Daniel Kinahan, the Kinahan gang, which is a massive gang based in one of the biggest gangs based in Dublin, and they are strongly linked with the managerial group MTK Boxing, which have signed most notably Tyson Fury. But the Kinahans have also been linked to armaments trading, money laundering, and drug dealing. So what this kind of shows is that sport can be used as a front for far more sinister illegal movements, as like we've discussed slavery, but also it can be not necessarily a government scheme, but also an illegal trafficking movement.
That's a good point. It's like in a way, I almost feel like sport in a lot of cases is a really big front. Like say organized crime or whatever would use a restaurant or something as a front. It's obviously somewhat limited because you can only put through so many drugs or money or whatever through that restaurant. But sport is just so massive on an international scale. It's almost like the biggest front ever. it's the biggest way possible of pumping money through to places that you want, and it's also, like we said, a way of deflecting attention away from the stuff that you do behind the scenes. It's a way of promoting the fact that, because everyone likes sport, everyone likes football. If you own a club, it's a way of making people forget all the shady shit you're doing on the side. And I bet that 99.9% of people, and I'm not trying to be edgy or elitist, but I don't think most people who watch football on a Saturday night with a beer or whatever, they don't care about who owns the club or what they do with the money that they get from owning the club. They don't think about that stuff because why would they? But obviously them watching and them supporting has an impact on what they do. And it's the same with boxing. I would argue that boxing, in fact, is very much on the up and up. It's almost, some people reckon it might overtake football in popularity soon, in particular just with the sort of the spectacle of it, the famous fights and stuff like that. So if those organizations, those fighters and whatever, the companies that orchestrate these things are owned by what are essentially gangs, that gives them a huge degree of power and influence just in general, just from having that influence.
Definitely. And that front of having something that is ostensibly legal is a really good facade to something that is illegal, and it makes their legitimacy there, therefore makes it harder for investigation groups to basically penetrate into them. What is very interesting about MTK Managerial Group is they don't charge a managerial fee for their top fighters, so which is very suspicious because most places charge a standard 25% rate managerial fee. So for being on their books and getting helping you get fights, you give them 25% of your winnings. But the fact that they don't but yet they're one of the largest fighting managerial groups is very, very suspicious. I mean, as a player or as a fighter or whatever, you want to succeed. You want to get signed to the best group that's most likely to make you the most successful. So at this point, I think, like you said, I think what can we do to prevent corruption on the business side of it, because there isn't, I can't see how, I through my research, I didn't really see how it was particularly easy to monitor or I guess regulate trading of fair deals.
I also just want to go.
Yeah, go on.
I just want to quickly go back to previous thing you said about how people don't necessarily keep an eye out on who's owning the clubs and all that kind of thing. I think that one trouble is that because of how set some people are on saying that politics isn't part of sport and shouldn't be part of sport, they're kind of naturally switched away from it, if that makes sense. One thing that's a really good example of that is I actually saw this week. So I don't know if people know, but Visit Rwanda sponsors Arsenal on the sleeve. The sleeve their kit has that, and they basically got all of the Arsenal players who, obviously, like I'm saying, we're all people that no one thinks of as politicians. They're just people that play for the team that people support. But they were basically just putting out outright Rwandan propaganda in the sense that they were saying how great all of the development in Rwanda have been, even though obviously it's still a dictatorship. I mean, there's been economic development and stuff, but basically just a completely one-sided argument in favor of a dictatorship. I mean, it was just, I had to mention it because it was crazy for me to watch that, and I think that's how they get away with it, because they're going off the outset of an area that for so many people are kind of switched off politically in a way, I think, when they're watching sport, partly because that's natural because it's entertainment, and partly because so many people want it to be like that.
In a less legitimate way, it's why people get so upset when, say, for example, football players take the knee and stuff like that. It's that people almost think that it's an entertainment industry, and they don't want sort of politics to infect it or sort of invade it. But the reality is that it sort of is already there, because, like we've already said, people own these clubs and they want to promote some sort of, they have some sort of ulterior motive. They don't just want to have it because they like football. They want it because they'll make themselves look good, or their country look good, or for some other reason.
What I would say is, though, that sport is political. If you look at, especially in football fans are notoriously homophobic, transphobic, and racist. And I think that it, for me, destroys a lot of the enjoyment that sport can provide. And so, to an extent, shouldn't sport try and, I guess, engage with politics in order to increase political participation?
This is what I mean. It's like people say that they don't want it to be political. I should be more clear. It's not necessarily that. I don't think they necessarily. It's hard to explain, but basically, I think they do, in a way, want it to be political, but they just want it to align with their politics. I think this is a general rule for most things, especially just any sort of entertainment industry, or any sort of entertainment in general. It's people say that I don't want to bring politics into it. Why are you bringing politics into it? It's just annoying. But realistically, I think what they sort of mean is they just want it. They want it to represent their politics. Because I think you're right. I think a lot of the people. I don't want to generalize, but yeah, I think a lot of sport culture has a lot to do with homophobia and well, like we said, this sort of tribal mentality. Like it's very hot-headed, hot-blooded. Like if you're not me, I don't like you type thing, and that extends to a lot of other facets. Like if you're not with us, you're against us type thing. I think that extends towards other things that people wouldn't particularly take to. And so people sort of need to realize that like politics is in everything, whether you like it or not, I suppose, is the bottom line.
I completely agree with that. I mean, there are a couple of things I want to come up with. Which is, firstly, I think that we shouldn't overgeneralize football fans, because I think whilst there certainly is like a lot of the racism and transphobia and homophobia within football, it's worth mentioning there are both clubs and also like ultra groups, which basically just supporters who are really like extra passionate, if you like, who are like fundamentally part of their core values are like progressive. Like they very much do exist. I think that most clubs are probably sort of based on don't especially in the UK, most clubs don't really have like political stances, and the supporters will all have different political opinions. Like if you support Man City, it's not like someone will say, "Oh, you're a Tory," or "Oh, you're Labour." There's no really association with that.
Yeah,
but
that's true.
in other countries, you do actually have ultras who will basically say, "Oh, I support this club," and part of their values are about being progressive. I mean, if you look at Barcelona, that's a team that really was based off the sort of resistance to the dictatorship and pro-Catalonia and that kind of thing, which obviously are very oppressed in that time and to some extent still. I also think that, I completely agree in terms of the problem being that they don't want it to be political, and we should just say that it is, and we have to accept that because everything is. And also, just with the take the knee, I think that that's actually people's problem with take the knee, for me, has actually been in some ways less to do with keeping politics out of sport. And I say that mainly because of how the reaction's been in the UK. In the UK, the reaction was initially largely positive to footballers taking the knee, I would say. And then people have sort of said that as time has gone, it's become an empty gesture because people are still accepting racism anyway. And it's not really doing anything, which is in some ways fair. It's like up to you whether you think you should still take the knee. I think that the problem that there was in the US was, and basically where the whole problem is conservatism. In that, I mean, partly people were obviously taking the knee initially, I believe the anthem, and obviously the conservatives in the US are, hugely about standing up for the flag and patriotism and all that kind of thing. And so I think that was where the problem came from. I think that in the UK there was a problem with taking the knee again from the Conservative Party, which obviously I'm not directly comparing them to the Republican Party because they are fundamentally different. But I think you still see that it's sort of like a different political view. It's not that they're in favour of the racism and that kind of thing, but I think you do definitely find that with the Conservative Party, for example, in this country, there's a denial over the existence of racism. I mean, that was the case if you look at that recent report that was released. And I just think that basically with Take the Knee, although there are many cases where the problem is keeping politics out of sport and it's that sort of false idea, I think that it's links to just politics and like people's views and conservatism, although in different contexts.
Yeah, I think it's you could argue this just is politics, but I would say it's more to do with the clashing of ideas. It's one thing if Marcus Rashford says on Twitter XYZ, that's one thing. But if it sort of interrupts football game, i.e., when players take the knee, I feel like that's more noticeable, and that's more of a direct sort of thing people can have a problem with. And again, like you say, it's very easy to boil these things down to simple terms, but it's not necessarily that if you have a problem with people taking the knee that it means you're a racist. You know, it just means that it just means that it's something that you're not used to, and it's something that's like alien to you, and you might think people are making a bigger deal about it than necessary or whatever.
It's only a game. Why you have to be mad?
Okay, I think that though that whilst football is political, I think other sports or sport can be used to exploit people in different ways, and that can be either, like we said, for the benefit of the state or for individual financial and monetary gain. And I want to discuss the exploitation of African players. So Africa, everyone, there are lots and lots of great players, football players and athletes that come out of Africa, and a lot of them are basically encouraged to be are recruited to foreign countries. Like Didier Drogba is a fantastic example. Or Mo Salah, also recruited from Africa, and now have become great players in the Premier League. But a lot of African players are basically exploited. A fake recruiter comes along and says, "I'll recruit you to a club," and there's leagues being established all over the world these days, in India and China and Nepal, and these players are told, or I will recruit you to this place, and then we will move you to a more established league once you've got yourself going. And so these players are told to pay for like their visa and their plane ticket. They're often very poor, so it takes a considerable amount of their financial their money. They often have to borrow from their families, and they can't afford a return ticket. So then arrive in Nepal. Nepal is not a great football nation, as I think most of us know, and there is no strong league, and they're not even given a club, and they arrive and they have no way of getting back, but their money's gone because the recruiter had walked off with the money, which not only affects the individual who's now stranded in a foreign country, but also the family back home who are now is also financially suffering as a consequence.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like in football specifically, you sort of hear these success stories, you know, in particular people who come from poorer countries and poorer backgrounds and stuff like that, and then they use football as a way to work their way up. And certainly for some people, I'm sure that that's a good way of sort of making a name for yourself. But yeah, you got to remember that for every person who makes it into the England football squad, there is probably about 100 more or more other people that just get unlucky, basically, get scammed. Like you say, they get promised because of they get taken advantage of because of their bad situation, told that they can make it big, and just end up paying the price for it.
Yeah, I think I was also just going to add to what James said, but I think that there's also the problem of exploitative contracts that often happens with African countries, and that, you know, you'll have certain footballers who basically, because they obviously may come from poorer backgrounds and don't really have a way of getting exposed to the different leagues getting out of Africa, they'll have little choice but sign on to a really exploitative agency, which will then, you know, try and control which club they pay for, perhaps try and control how much money they get. And I'm certain that there have been like really promising careers that, you know, could have obviously, because you don't even need to make to the elite level of football to have a very, very good living, you know, even just at the top, you can do very well. And, you know, I've definitely heard of stories of players who just have had all of that taken from them by these exploitative agencies. And that's why there's certain, you know, I've seen cases where that's happened and the players have gone on to actually try and make sort of law agencies to fight for the players to enable them to get out of these difficult contracts, because I think things are sometimes most difficult to confront when they are legal because of how there's just so little that a player can do at times, and they're trying to be more educational about stopping this kind of trade because it's just so harmful to people that would have opportunities through the sport that they love.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Of-
gone.
Often these people, they don't have a great education themselves, so they don't know how to advocate for themselves. So they are literally at the mercy of these people. They don't know how to escape, and they don't have the financial or social. Sport was meant to provide them the social mobility to escape, but they cannot escape. So it's a very I guess it's exploitative system. Continue, Ed.
No, yeah, that's basically what I was going to say. It's in an ideal world, it could be a way for many people to, like you say, as a good method of social mobility, especially if you have some sort of talent. I think that's a good thing. If you have some sort of talent that can be useful, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to make it famous, make it big. That's completely that's very admirable. It's just unfortunate then that again these there's this whole other side, these faceless companies that control the sporting world, control the football world, come in and take away this whole aspect of it. Because you know football and sport in general is many things to many people, but really to the people who own it, to the people who run it effectively, it is only one thing, and that's money. to be very cynical, like that's what it comes down to. It's you I'm sure many people have grown up with sport and they love it and it's like their whole life, and that feeling is what companies and individuals take advantage of. Then they've made it into this huge business, which is very unfortunate. Again, I'm not a sportsman myself, but I can understand the appeal, and I think it's a real shame that it's sort of been tainted in this way, because in many ways I think it's a very fruitful endeavor for many people.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, the idea of I guess the wealth that is acquired is a massive reason for countries or businesses to promote it, because it large sporting events recruit means that lots of tourists come to that country and visit it for the sporting event, and also so it creates a wealth of opportunities for other financial gains through that sporting event, and this can lead to countries wanting to better their team through artificial means beyond training to basically make the country look good and look prestigious. And most famously and recently, Russia has been in front of this. They were caught doping at the Sochi Olympics, the Sochi Winter Olympics in 2014, and then the track and athletics team. They were then subsequently banned for 4 years from hosting any international tournaments through WADA, which is the World Anti-Doping Agency, and they're banned from applying to international tournaments as well, such as the 2032 Olympics. However, the problem is that because all sports do not have the same sort of monitoring groups, it means that there are kind of loopholes around this. So, for example, because UEFA isn't linked to WADA, there hasn't really been noticed any. Russia can still participate in football, most notably, and so the St. Petersburg 2020 European Championships is still going to take place, even though Russia has been caught state doping. So it's likely that the Russian football team is also doping, but because UEFA isn't linked to WADA and UEFA has its own motives, Russia is still allowed to compete in another sport.
Yeah. It's a free market still, ultimately. So these sports are different. So they're obviously governed by different bodies and all that stuff. So at the end of the day, it's a weird thing where these companies basically decide on their own rules, and you might get banned for 5 years or whatever from participating in the Winter Olympics, but they'll be able to play football just as normal, even though, like you say, it's probably the case that they're doping there as well.
Which makes me want to pose the question to you two. Do you think there should be sort of like a United Nations monitoring system for sports, where both private companies and states are monitored for both business policy within sport and doping and anti-doping measures?
Well, I think that the trouble with that is, you basically just have to look at what's happened with FIFA, because FIFA is obviously the international governing organization for the biggest and most popular sport, and it's just been so easy to infiltrate. I think that, like, so many precautions obviously will have been taken to avoid it, but I mean, it's entirely infiltrated. Most of the especially actually in the drop-down organizations, like the ones for each, basically FIFA's delegate for each continent. If you look at how many FIFA offices in Switzerland have been raided and all that kind of thing, I think that it would just be too impossible to stop the corruption with, because it wouldn't be a proper government body. And so I just think that it wouldn't work. And I think even if it did, it would probably be aware that in order to self-sustain, it would have to give in to business interests. So it would probably end up just protecting, like FIFA and UEFA do, it would just end up protecting commercial interests that are against the interest of sport.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat. It's for whatever would be gained in the short term, it would just get to the point where, it would be infiltrated, bought up. Because you said, I know you only use this as a terminology, but the United Nations is obviously political in nature, and then it has its corrupt elements to it. But when there's an element of, when there's the free market involved, basically, where it's because even if it is this conglomerate of everything is governed by this same body, it is ultimately going to be a financial business. It's basically going to be a business, like a big business. So, and that will inherently have its avenues for corruption and susceptibility to being paid off. In fact, you might even see in that case that it would be countries like Russia, for example, would face even less repercussions if they had some big stake in this hypothetical conglomerate. If they were tactful enough, they could effectively dope all they want and face no repercussions if they made it good with the conglomerate. So unfortunately, I don't think this kind of problem will have any sort of reasonable solution, because it's ultimately all driven by money.
Well, I think I suppose the Olympics is easier to monitor, because to participate in the Olympics you have to be an amateur. So I guess that is, which is why they have the International Olympic Committee, the IOC. They're much better at monitoring this, and I think being stricter about anti-doping policy. But I probably state corruption, things like that, such as the Russian scandal. And also the Olympics is, although it does generate the wealth for the country, it does very much try and aim to be basically a peaceful demonstration. It's almost like a celebration of friendly competition, is what I would, I guess, say.
Yeah.
Whereas, I mean, I don't really pay attention to the bookies, but I've not heard of people betting on results in the Olympics. At least they haven't gone to Ladbrokes or William Hill or whatever and bet.
I think it goes
Well,
back to what you briefly said about China. I think that the comparisons between that and like FIFA, for example, football on a global scale in a business sense is very much still motivated by money, whereas the Olympics have such a nationalistic side to them that countries are in a way more driven to succeed just based on how it makes their country look good, and to a unhealthy degree in many cases, like with the camps in China. There's no financial gain there. It's a very strange way to think about it in a way, because it's almost like the Cold War era mentality. It's just like the whole making your own country look good, even though it doesn't really mean anything, because it just means that you're if you really think about it, it's like your country wins the Olympics. That has no bearing on whether your country is a good country. It just means that your athletes are good. Like it's really silly.
Well, it's a projection of wealth, because you can afford to have all of these to set up all of these different opportunities for people to engage in sport and then become good, and that requires real industrialization. So that it is a demonstration of wealth, because if you look at the countries that notoriously are at the top of the Olympic leaderboard table, it's most recently it's China, America, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, France. These nations are more economically developed countries with greater amounts of wealth. I think Russia always does quite well. So there's an emphasis on I guess having the opportunity and the wealth to be able to do well. I mean, Jamaica might, for example, do very well in the track and field events, but beyond that, they don't. Whereas if you look at, say, the UK does very well in the swimming. It does very well it does well on the track. It does quite well on the track and field. It does well in sports like hockey and kayaking, and it does well in shooting, and it does well across the field. It does well in gymnastics, compared to like some like other countries that just have like a specialist focus, which kind of demonstrates the wealth of opportunity.
That's very true. It's very true. Anything last to add from either of you?
No, just if anyone says keep politics out of sport, tell them to go and listen to this podcast.
Excellent. Exactly. And with that, I will say thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.